Today we hear a lot about the climate crisis, that the world is coming to an end. Well, is it true? Let's have a discussion today about the state of our climate today.
A clear path forward requires looking back and learning. Good public policy requires human connection. It's a consideration of the facts, applying common sense, and innovation. It's urban, it's rural, it's real life. We all have something to contribute. We all have a responsibility to get informed because there's a little piece of Canada in all of us, isn't there? Let's learn on this path together. This is Leaders on the Frontier.
Well, today I'm honored to have a very special guest to talk about climate change and the climate crisis. He's both an author and geologist. He's also the executive director of the CO2 Coalition. And with me here today is Greg Wrightstone. Welcome, Greg.
Oh, thank you so much. Actually, the organization I lead is the CO2 Coalition. And so we've got some 160 of the top scientists in the world that I'm just so proud to be a leader of this group. We have a Nobel laureate that sits on our board, John Clauser, other distinguished, many physicists. I'm a geologist, but we promote the little known facts that are kept secret and quiet about the many benefits of both warming and more CO2.
Well, it certainly is fascinating, the CO2 Coalition, which you're the executive director of, Greg. It's fascinating because it's almost like in the title, it confronts us with a very different set of facts than we're used to hearing, because constantly we hear a drumbeat that CO2, specifically carbon dioxide, is a pollutant. But that's not what you're saying. Is that right?
Oh my goodness, no. The CO2 is more CO2 has been hugely beneficial to both our ecosystems and by we're accruing that benefit to us, the human conditions improving, humanity's prospering because partly more CO2 is driving, and the biggest benefit is the increase in agricultural output because CO2's more CO2, of course. If you think back to your early schooling, you learned about photosynthesis. You might add a
Yes.
small cup with soil and you put a bean seed in it, and you learned that, and that bean sprouted, that three
Mhm.
main things that plants need, it's sunlight, water, and CO2, and the more CO2 the better. And
You
we're
know,
seeing this greening of the earth, vegetation for almost every ecological niche is just exploding.
it's so funny you mentioned about the reflection of really a childhood memory that probably most of us have done, where we put as you said, a bean seed into a cup with some soil, and we learn those basics around the science of, well, really everything in terms of both plant life, but life on this planet in general is really necessitated and enabled by carbon dioxide. That's the point, isn't it, Greg?
It is. And as a geologist, I put this into a long-term perspective of thousands and millions of years. And looking at the long-term perspective, we see that we're being told that carbon dioxide is at dangerously high levels. And it's increasing. Looking at the long-term consequence, we're actually in a CO2 famine. We're near historic low levels of
Sorry,
carbon
wait a sec
dioxide.
here. You used a term, a CO2 famine. What do you mean by that?
Well, we're at today, as we sit here, we are seeing about 420 parts per million in the atmosphere, atmospheric CO2. Uh, and Earth's history, though, if you look back through to the end of the Precambrian era, it
Hmm.
averaged 2,600 parts per million, six and a half times what it is today. And it's only been in the very recent past, or recent to a geologist over the last several million years, that we have such low levels of carbon dioxide. And our plants and our crops that evolved, they began during times of carbon dioxide levels of greater than 2,000. Again, we're at 400. And so we're looking at five times the amount of CO2 that these plants originated using. And so, of course, plants, since they can't speak, I speak for them. If they had a vote in the matter, they'd be raising, if they hand to raise, they'd be raising their hand and going, more CO2, more CO2. Uh, because although we're at better levels of CO2 that's driving plant growth, we're still not at optimum levels. That
Isn't
might
that
not,
fascinating? So this is a perspective you will never, almost never hear within the public square and mainstream media. So I'm fascinating though. How do you respond though to the whole idea that, and you get this warning on anything on social media, you'll always see that little paragraph saying that the long-term trend is the concern is about the use of fossil fuels and that carbon dioxide is a problem. So, but that's human created. So are we talking about two different things here then, Greg? Are we
no,
talking about the
no.
difference between natural CO2 and human-made CO2?
Before the Industrial Revolution began, before we started using coal, oil, and natural gas, CO2 levels, remember we're at 420 today, 400 or so. It was at 280. So that difference between 280 parts per million and 400 parts per million or 420, it's about a 50% increase in the atmosphere. And it's because of us using CO2. It just is. And I'm okay with that because we're seeing many benefits from this. We're seeing that I live a high carbon lifestyle and I'm proud of that. I drive two SUVs. I
Is
heat my home in the winter with natural gas and I cool it and temperature in my home in the summer is comfortably cool and it's comfortably warm in the winter because, as we'll get into a little bit, there is no climate crisis. What they're doing is the warnings you hear will be from models, climate models that can't model temperature very well. We know that for a fact that they overpredict warming that
okay. So,
increasing CO2 will generate.
gosh, this is again a totally different narrative. So, is there a relationship between CO2 and increased temperatures?
There, if you look over the long term, we have we're in a warming trend. This is it's a little complicated, but we're in a warming trend. The warming trend started. Let's go back just a step. We started adding prodigious amounts of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere in the middle of the 20th century. That post World War II economic boom, that's when we really started adding CO2. So if CO2 is going to drive temperatures, we should see it in the last 70 years or so when we started adding CO2. But the warming trend we're in actually started more than 300 years ago, long before we started adding CO2 to the atmosphere. So the first 60 or 70%, 75% of this warming trend we're in occurred and had to be naturally driven. And they're telling us now that since 1950, well, it's all from CO2. That's just not, it's not true. And we can look at from almost every metric and age length. If you look at decades, hundreds, thousands, and millions of years, there's no relationship between CO2 and temperature. We
Okay.
do see there is a we do see over the last several million years that when we went into a glacial event, things cooled, oceans cooled, and when cooling oceans suck up huge amounts of CO2, uh, warming oceans that heat up expel CO2. So what we see is actually an inverse relationship over the last 800,000 years of hot periods having low CO2 and cold periods having high CO2.
Okay. So although as I'm a keen observer of science, I'm not a scientist, and you are. You're a geologist. I believe you're also on some of the UN panels that review the science. And you're the executive director of the CO2 Coalition. And you've also written a number of books on these issues. I remember reading your book called Inconvenient Facts, which I loved. But you've also come up with a more recent book, A Very Convenient Warming. So can you tell us more about why you wrote this book, Greg?
Yeah, the first book was Inconvenient Facts. I wrote that in 2017, and as recently as 2 months ago, it was back as a number one bestseller in several categories on Amazon. It's been
Well,
I've had a
congratulations.
number I've had a number of people I respect that tell me that it's the if you're going to buy one book about climate change, get Inconvenient Facts. because it's very readable. I I didn't dumb it down, but I made it so a non-scientist can understand it, and that's very necessary. And in Inconvenient Facts, I spelled out that there is no climate crisis, and I compared, looked at the various crises that are told we'll experience to find out that there is no climate crisis after all. This book, though, I've advanced that thinking, and we have here too at the CO2 Coalition, and we find that warming and more CO2 have been greatly beneficial to mankind, to our
Mhm.
ecosystems. Almost every metric you look at uh, about our ecosystems and the human condition, we see benefits. Fires
Mhm.
aren't increasing, they're decreasing. Deserts aren't expanding, they're shrinking. Food production is breaking records year after year after year, and that's attributable to warming temperatures, which means we have longer growing seasons. I didn't look what it was in Canada, but the growing season for continental United States has increased by more than 2 weeks since 1900. That's a good thing because it's warming. We see the killing frosts end earlier in the spring and arrive later in the fall, which is huge for agriculture. And we see that CO2 is a boost, turbocharging this crop growth. And it's also crops are breaking records because of the use of nitrogen fertilizer, which is derived from fossil fuels. It's a it's really, I call it the greatest untold story of the 21st century, that
Isn't that something?
of a thriving earth, thriving ecosystems. We should celebrate.
So, but at the heart of this story of thriving ecosystems is the story and the importance of carbon dioxide, among other elements, and these long cycles throughout human history. So the whole narrative that human created carbon dioxide is really the source of all our woes, and that it's an existential climate crisis, I think is said all the time. And I want to share with you a clip here that I think illustrates that.
Imagine a chair sitting flat on the ground. Adding a small tilt won't change much, but if our director is leaning back in the chair, precariously balanced, and adds just a tiny degree more lean, the chair reaches its tipping point and suddenly falls until it finds its next stable state. And this is essentially what's happening to our planet's climate. Many of our planet's systems getting precariously close to sudden, potentially irreversible change.
So there you go, Greg. There's one snippet of many where they're essentially arguing that 1 degree difference in warming will essentially be like that chair tipping over, and then we're all done. We're all gone, Greg. Is that an accurate message in your opinion?
What we find is that no, the warming trend that we're in today looks very similar to past warming trends over the last 10,000 years. And we find these other warming trends, uh, going back to the first great civilizations, there were three of them. We're in the fourth warming trend. These great civilizations arose during what was called the Bronze Age. It was the Minoan warm period. It was very warm at that time. And the great civilizations first arose, the Babylonians, the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Harappan's empire in this Indus River Valley. All these great civilizations rose up. We know it was a lot warmer from historical records, in addition to scientific
Mm-hmm.
uh, proxies, is what we call them. We know that, for example, they were growing a crop called millet in Scandinavia, which can only be grown in subtropical areas. So we
Mm-hmm.
know, just using historical records like that, we know it was a lot warmer. Uh, the Roman warm period was the time of Christ. During the Roman warm period, they were growing citrus in the north of England near Hadrian's Wall. Well, you
Wow.
can't do that today.
Mm-hmm.
So we can use that historical data uh, to talk about and we see what we see consistently. And in the second section of my new book, I love the relationship between human history and climate history to find that each of the warming periods were hugely beneficial to mankind. Again, we had prodigious food production, and it was the cold periods that turned out to be horrific. Each of the cold periods we went into, they went by the names of the Greek Dark Ages, the Dark Ages, and the Little Ice Age. Uh, and we find that the cold periods were horrific, horrific. The cold periods were associated with crop failure, famine, pestilence, and mass depopulation. The warming periods, warmer than today, were associated with great bounty, great agriculture. Again, life was good. And so they need to look back. They call me a science denier. I call them history deniers because they're denying what actually happened during previous warm periods. And those warm periods were marvelously beneficial to the human condition.
Okay, so let's challenge your narrative a little bit. I recall a number of years ago when your president, U.S. President, I believe Barack Obama, asserted consistently that there was a consensus among scientists that, in fact, human created carbon dioxide was the source of global warming and that it was an existential threat. So, are you against the consensus of scientists?
Well, that's not how science works. Michael Crichton famously said, if it's science, it's not consensus. And if it's consensus, it's not science. In
Hmm.
science, the scientific method demands that we look at all data that's available and challenge these notions. And by blocking out anything that disputes this narrative of a climate crisis driven by CO2 and warming, that's just not part of the scientific process. Dr.
Hmm.
Richard Feynman famously said, I'd rather have uh, theories that or answers that can't be. Excuse me, I'm getting it mixed up. I'd rather have answers that we can't determine than answers that can't be challenged.
Hmm.
And so this consensus has no place in science. If you're looking to the consensus, well, then you've lost the argument already. We make a case and a compelling argument here using science, facts, and data to back up our information.
Okay, so the whole notion of consensus is actually anti science, then, in the sense that science operates on a healthy level of debate and open mindedness regarding testing ideas and trying to reflect on that information. So the whole idea of a consensus is absurd.
Yeah, now let me get the Feynman quote right. I kind of stumbled there. He said, I'd rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. And that's what
Hmm.
we have here. They came to this conclusion, and you
Hmm.
dare not challenge it.
Yeah.
For example, I was just booted off LinkedIn again this weekend permanently. I was booted off 4 years ago for spreading the climate truth. They called it false and misleading. And this is how they do it. My very last post on LinkedIn, I said, I think I'm going to be banned and deplatformed on LinkedIn. They removed that post, called it false and misleading, and then they banned and deplatformed me. Uh, it's kind of funny, but what are you going to do? But that's how they need to silence anything that's in opposition to this climate crisis narrative.
Wow. So help us understand what's going on, because I think in the larger public sphere, a lot of members of the public are bewildered by all this talk that, you can hear Greta Thunberg saying, how dare you, and that the world's coming to end. I hear Al Gore saying the oceans are boiling. Is it, it's kind of confusing because we think that with all those dramatics, the world is at an existential point when it comes to climate, and that people like you, Greg, just don't get it. And we're going to shut you down because, heaven forbid, if you spoke up and people agreed with you, then the world would come to an end. So they really believe the ends justify the means. Or why is this happening in your perspective, Greg, as to why you would be, for example, canceled off of LinkedIn?
Well, again, there's a very good reason to cancel me and to silence my colleagues at the CO2 Coalition because we make a lot of sense. We provide science and data that says
Hmm.
no, 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 it's not. This crisis is not occurring. Life's getting better. Ecosystems are thriving. They need to silence us. As for their motives, I can't look inside men's and women's souls and their
Hmm.
hearts to see what motivates them. Everyone watching this today is just as qualified as I am to tell you why they're doing it. I can't do that. But as a scientist, what I can do is say, okay, this is what they're telling you, and here are the science and the facts that dispute that, and just
Hmm.
look at that. And I believe that the information that we provide provides a really compelling case that backs up our notion of a thriving and improving Earth.
Okay, so we certainly need a variety of voices and open public discussion. And what I marvel at is the consistent repeat that almost any event that happens that is negative, like a flooding event, a hurricane, all kinds of events are immediately blamed on, quote, the climate crisis of human made use of fossil fuels. So that is clearly, you wouldn't agree with that. Is that correct?
Oh, not at all. No, no, we see just the opposite. Again, we like more CO2. We promote the many benefits. In fact, I'll be traveling to the Netherlands, flying to Amsterdam in 2 weeks, where I'll be doing a week-long tour of the Netherlands. They're publishing my new book in Dutch, and so we're doing a book promotion tour of that. But the Netherlands just last week, the Netherlands before last week were one of the most horrifically bad countries on earth promoting uh, this climate net zero. They were going to say they were going to put 50% of the Dutch farmers. We're going to have to kill half of the livestock. They were going to put farmers out of business, forcibly buy up their farms. And they said no. They had tractor protests all over the Netherlands. The people themselves rose up and said no, and they'll be thrown out on their ear pretty shortly, and I'll be there to celebrate it.
So, to be clear, in the Netherlands, and we've certainly seen this in other nations as well, there was a policy set in motion called the so called net zero policies. And I think Canada is very much on that track as well as the United States. And you're saying in the Netherlands, they had to, in their fervent attempt to achieve those goals, they were positioning to kill half their livestock. Is
50%
that
of the
correct, Greg?
livestock, cattle. Not if you conclude, it's cattle that they were saying needed to be taken because they belch, they release methane, which they call is it a greenhouse gas? Yes. But we've done papers here at the CO2 Coalition about methane. And in fact, a lot of this information is available at our website, which is co2coalition.org. You can go there, search for methane. You can see the paper that was done by Dr. Richard Lindzen, Methane and Climate, to find that the warming potential of methane is tremendously small. It's smaller than we can even measure. CO2 is just slightly more than that with warming potential. These other greenhouse gases are overwhelmed by other natural forces that tend to either warm or cool the planet.
So, in this context, there's a whole raft of policies that are being pursued in the name of saving the planet from climate change. In Canada, we have the so called just transition, which will really arguably transform every aspect of our lives as they work to shut down Canadian oil and gas, as they look at and all those costs are they cascade through every industry, whether it's forestry, agriculture, as we just talked about a little bit, whether it's manufacturing. I mean, it's every sector is lined up like a domino that will be impacted by these policies. From your perspective, what are the impacts that affect people's daily lives that we should be concerned about here?
It might be easier for me to tell you what won't be affected. Here in the United States, we've got the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. We've got the Department of Energy led by Jennifer Granholm. And these people, what they're looking to do is to control every aspect of your life. They want to take away your freedoms, freedom to choose what kind of car to drive, how to heat your home, how much water comes out of your shower, how much water can be used in your dishwasher. 3 weeks ago, they talked about ceiling fans, that they weren't energy efficient enough. It's all for your own good. Don't you understand? We want you to save money, and it'll cost you more to buy it, but you'll make up for with the energy savings in 30 or 40 or 50 years. So just don't you worry if things get more expensive. They want to control what you eat. They don't want you eating meat. Uh, They want to try and control in the EU how many flights you can take every year. No, thank you.
Sorry,
No,
they're
no,
looking
thank you.
at limiting that you cannot eat meat and how many flights you can take
Your
ultimately.
Trudeau's recommending not eating meat. We're seeing that all over the world as this push uh, against meat eating, beef in particular, because of the steers and cows that belch methane. And it's what animals and cows and steers do is they eat the grasses that can't otherwise be digestible, and they turn that into the meat that we eat. And so the cattle make great sacrifices for our dinners and our lunches, and I want to thank all the cattle that have made that sacrifice.
Well,
Uh,
indeed.
I,
But in this context, Greg, let's be clear, like the onslaught of legislation that I think you're right will transform every aspect of our lives is really hard to wrap our heads around. So, do you think most Americans, in your case, are aware of the impacts that are being waged on their life?
well, I think they're becoming more aware when you're telling people you're not going to be able to buy an internal combustion car, you have to buy an EV, an electric vehicle, by a certain date, which is what they're trying to do. They're being told people are understanding too that their electricity rates are going to skyrocket. All of this we're talking about increasing electricity usage. At the same time, we're taking away the electricity manufacturing, the coal-fired plants, natural gas-fired plants that provide reliable, abundant, affordable energy. And that's how we should look at electricity with those three words: reliable, abundant, and affordable. Wind and solar are not any of those. And in fact, if you look at what they're trying to do again is it's a loss of our freedoms, a loss of our ability to choose. And we're not going to put up with it in the United States. I'm very, very optimistic, though. Almost everybody I talk to, just random people, are thirsty for this information that we provide because they've never heard it. My wife and I went just no matter where we go, I strike up a conversation and people go, their eyes get wide. What you're saying, and I can pull out my uh, I've got a smartphone app that I had for my first book. If you just search for at the App Store, Google Play, inconvenient facts, it'll come up with 60 charts that are really great. And you can have this information in the palm of your hands, which I did just 2 days ago with the gentleman at the restaurant. And I find people are just thirsty for this information.
Isn't that
Almost
fascinating?
everybody's open to it. And it's good to educate yourself, but it's also nice to have that inconvenient fact smartphone. It's free. I'm not making any money out of it. I just want to
Yeah.
inform people.
Well, that's great. And what strikes me about this conversation, Greg, as well, is that when you're talking with fellow citizens, I think you realize that when leaders that are advocates for these radical policies are leading often with fear, emotion, or shame, like the use of, for example, the phrase you are a climate denier," suggests that we're not here to talk about the facts or the information. We're here to shame you, to use emotion to manipulate your sense of compassion into adopting a sense of policy. So I think those are red flags. But I think the other red flags that are happening, and you alluded to this, is the pain that is happening from the implementation of policies. In Canada, on April the 1st, we had another set of major federal income, or sorry, a new set of major taxes implemented on April 1st in this country. And that has created a massive debate. And so the federal government, the prime minister, is certainly on the defensive. So I wanted to share a clip with you about that discussion.
The Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is with us in studio. Prime Minister, welcome back to The Current.
Good to be back, Matt.
Glad to have you here. It feels a bit like an election campaign. You're zipping across the country here and there, announcing things with big dollar signs attached to them.
Well, we got a big budget coming out, and it's one that's focused on the fact that far too many young people, particularly millennials and Gen Z, don't feel like the system works for them anymore. Even if they have a great job, they are squeezed on housing. They're squeezed on rent. They can't save up for buying a home. They're pressed on groceries. They're seeing a world where climate change is getting worse and worse. They're worried about their future, and government has a role in making sure that there is fairness for them.
Let me talk about that in a minute. I want to begin with the news of the week in some ways, which is still the carbon tax. No matter what else you seem to speak about, people are focused on the price on carbon. We have seen an increase up to, $80 per ton this week. A liter of gas now costs 3 cents more. Do you think you've made a convincing case to Canadians that that increase is a good thing?
Well, I think we can put the case aside for a second and let's talk about the actual policy.
The case matters because people are protesting, wondering whether this actually works for them.
Of course, the case matters, but let's make sure we're talking about the same thing. We designed a price on pollution in this country that gives more money back to average Canadians, to 8 out of 10 Canadian families, particularly middle income and low income people. So we're not only fighting climate change, we're putting more money in the pockets of folks who need it through the Canada Carbon Rebate. That's the framework we built with all premiers working together back in 2016.
Do you think you've made that case?
I think we're continuing to make that case. It's understandable that at a time of anxiety, of pressure on costs, of affordability concerns, that some politicians are trying to drum up support for themselves by scaring people and by giving misinformation. It's unfortunate, but we're going to continue telling the truth.
So just to be clear, you don't think you've lost the narrative on this? We had a conversation this week with somebody who's a defender of the carbon tax. He explained it. He talked about it as a dumpster fire in terms of how it's rolled out. You don't think you've lost the narrative on this?
Well, I think what we've actually done in the policy, it is helping Canadians. Now, the fact that Conservative premiers or the Conservative leader of the opposition wants to take away those supports for Canadians, that's something that people need to hear. And that's not something that they're talking about. So we're continuing to talk about the fact that they have no plan to fight climate change and no plan to keep supporting people with affordability.
So there you have, there's our Prime Minister defending a major public policy move, namely the imposition of a carbon tax. Does that make any sense from your perspective, Greg?
Oh, not at all. Not at all. He probably, I believe, is a true believer. I think he like many of the politicians, have never heard the facts, the science, and the data that are in opposition to this notion of a climate crisis. And if there was a climate crisis, which was being driven by increasing CO2, of course we should get on board, but it's just not happening. The facts aren't there to back that up. He talks about misinformation. The misinformation's coming from him. The misinformation's coming from many of the scientists that have betrayed the scientific process and the scientific method by stifling science and not promoting it. It's there's so much to be unpacked in what the Prime Minister said there. He needs an education on this. And I would be willing, I volunteer to travel. If he can spare 30 minutes, I'll travel and sit down with him and show him some uncomfortable facts where he's just wrong.
Yeah, well, maybe I could join you, Greg, in that mission to have a healthy debate and discussion regarding what are the facts and information regardless. But regardless, it is really quite stunning, that kind of discussion. I mean, there's a lot to unpack, as you said, but they really seem to be losing the narrative. Like people, and I'll just give you an example. Last year, I saw my bank teller, and she just said, with all the price of gasoline on my car, and she said, I need a car because I live about a half an hour away. With the increased costs, I can't work in this job anymore. I've got to find another job. And this is really having an impact, these policies, on people's lives. Like, this is not to be taken lightly. And I think that people are just busy trying to, raise their families and go about their work. When these policies come onto their head, and that means an extra couple $100 potentially every month, they're looking at this and saying, what are we doing here? So I think you're right, Greg. We have to have perspective on, yes, we care for the environment, but is this really true what they're telling us, that the world's all coming to an end unless we go ahead with what? Increase more taxes. I mean, it seems absurd, doesn't it?
It does. We have, if you look on our board of directors, Patrick Moore sits on. He's a fellow Canadian, lives on
And a
Vancouver
senior
Island.
fellow at Frontier, by the way.
Very good. Patrick actually hired me. He sat in as chairman of the CO2 Coalition while Dr. Happer spent a year with the Trump administration as science advisor. That didn't go very well, but he was pushed back at every opening and everything he proposed in the Trump administration. His Trump's handlers would shut him down. But Patrick actually hired me as executive director, and you are probably also aware that he was a co-founder of Greenpeace, and he led the Canadian arm of Greenpeace for many
Indeed.
years. And then they lost its way. It lost its way. If you look now, Greenpeace is in favor of offshore wind turbines. That it sure looks like they're impacting whales, and not in a good way. And we're talking. I'd love to get him on a Zodiac boat out there to where they're constructing these new whale killing wind turbines.
Well, yeah, and I think what you're referring to is really significant is the great Dr. Patrick Moore, co-founder of Greenpeace, and certainly on your board and also a senior fellow at Frontier. But Dr. Patrick Moore, I think he has a quite a powerful story about how he cared deeply and continues to care deeply about the environment. But I think what you said is very significant, Greg, is that it almost seems like so many of these organizations have lost their way. Now, what do you mean by that? In the sense that radical environmentalism has almost become like a religion to them, that they've lost the healthy area and room for debate and discussion like the scientific method.
Exactly. They lost their way, particularly with Greenpeace and Dr. Moore. It was whenever they came out campaigning against chlorine and water. I think is the tipping point for him. And if you'll talk to him, and I imagine you have, he'll tell you that chlorine might be the one thing that saved more lives over the last
Indeed.
several hundred years than anything else, because we're now chlorinating our water, and we have safe drinking water. And so because of that, deaths from cholera and dysentery, things like that have been, at least in the developed world, have been wiped out. And he says they were campaigning against it because they wanted pure water, fresh water, uncontaminated by pollutants like chlorine. And they use words like that. And he said, this is just wrong. They're campaigning. He's the founder of a campaign for golden rice, which means that they have nutrients and vitamins, vitamin deficiency. I believe it's A, in much of the developing world that eats white rice in Southeast Asia and others. This golden rice has the vitamins that are needed that can prevent blindness and other impacts of vitamin A deficiency. And
Exactly.
he's being pushed. They're saying, oh no, it's genetically modified. Well, guess what? Just about everything you eat has been genetically modified one way or another, either by nature or sometimes developed through various processes. And so his campaign for golden rice is one that's very noble.
It really is. And I think what you're really challenging us to think about, Greg, among others like Dr. Patrick Moore, is to keep a very thoughtful perspective on the relative risks and the many complex variables behind causation. And that we can't just recklessly assert that it's just because of one thing and that somehow shutting down all of Canada and the United States, which would arguably not change anything when it comes to the environment, even if you agree with the models that are being proposed. So it really is a call for sanity. It seems like that's what you're calling for is
It
common
it
sense and
is.
sanity.
It is. And just if I when I show people my graphs that I have in my new book about agricultural productivity, we see, and isn't that pretty important? That might be the most important thing we have to look at instead of claims of upcoming famine. It's just the opposite. One chart in my book, I capture the top 8 crops in the world in terms of tonnage produced, and all 8, you just see the charts, breaking records year after year after year. We find it's occurring in some of the coldest countries on earth and some of the warmest, like India. India crop production. I'm reviewing a paper now. One of our research associates, Vijay Jayaraj, was from southern India, Bangalore. And he just moved to Scotland, where it's cold and rainy, and so it's quite been a transition from hot southern India to the cold of Scotland. But he's writing a paper on India and agriculture right now for us, and so a hot nation like India is reaping the benefits of more CO2. And again,
Exactly.
they're seeing longer growing seasons in India as well. These are huge, huge, huge. We're feeding the population of the earth. On another chart in my book, I compare and show that agricultural productivity is outpacing greatly increases in population growth. So the population, is it growing? Sure it is. But we're able to feed that growing population and much more with with the benefits of warming, CO2, and nitrogen fertilizer. And these are that we saw what happened when Sri Lanka, here was about 2.5 years ago, the president of Sri Lanka, President Rajapaksa, determined that they weren't going to use any artificial fertilizers. We're going to go organic. Well, that might work a little well if you've got a backyard garden, but it really doesn't work very well on a nationwide basis with large scale agriculture. For Sri Lanka, it's rice, tea plantation, and their entire agricultural based economy within a few months collapsed because they stopped using nitrogen fertilizers for no reason. Just it's this climate scare that everyone's bought into. They chased Rajapaksa, the president, out of the country, barely escaped with his life, and now they're back to using nitrogen fertilizer, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And in fact, we talked a little bit before about this great productivity. The alarmists can't dispute that. It is so obvious, so real. The vegetation's increasing, agriculture's exploding. Well, what they've done recently is, well, okay, you're growing more crops, but the nutritional value of those crops is lessened. And so we've just published last week a paper on that. Dr. Happer, Dr. Linson, Steve Koonin, I believe he was one of the authors. I was one of the authors, Vijay Jayaraj. It's on nutrition and CO2. What is increasing carbon dioxide doing to the nutritional value of plants? And it's just disputing that. And it was a paper that needed writing, and we've just published that. That again, go to co2coalition.org and Google nutrition. You'll be able to find that paper.
Yeah, so be sure to look at that. And I think, Greg, your reference to the international scene is a very powerful one. And I do, this whole discussion regarding the international scene strikes me as very important in the sense that reliable, affordable, dependable energy, abundant, is critical to the future not only of our countries, but every nation around the world. And what I find interesting is that the climate alarmism is really a call to shut down the use of all fossil fuels, oil, gas, things that are really foundational for our lives around the world. And so in many respects, I think that what we need to do is also recognize that what we have is really not a climate crisis by any measure. It's really an energy crisis that's being self-imposed. And I did want to share with you this clip from our friend Alex Epstein a little bit more about this.
The world faces a serious crisis, one that will ruin whole economies and lead to needless suffering and death. The crisis is related to climate change, but not in the way you're probably thinking. It's the global energy crisis, a man-made crisis created by climate change policies. These policies have led to a shortage of fossil fuels, oil, coal, and natural gas, the fuels that provide over 80% of the world's energy. A shortage of anything leads to higher prices. That's just basic economics. Fossil fuel shortages have led to higher energy prices. And because the energy industry powers every other industry, this has led to higher prices of almost everything, everywhere. We are already seeing the consequences. Inflation. Inflation spares no one, but those who live paycheck to paycheck suffer the most. Every purchase becomes a major decision. Inflation in the US in 2022 was around 8%. In the UK, 10%, and in many developing countries, much higher. The leading driver of this inflation has been the cost of energy. Deadly winters. Contrary to popular belief, far more people die from cold than heat. Saving lives from the danger of cold requires low-cost, reliable energy. Without it, people on the margins can't adequately heat their homes during the harsh winter months. Even in wealthy Europe, literally thousands will die for lack of energy. Widespread job losses. When energy prices increase dramatically, industries scale back or shut down altogether. As the Wall Street Journal reports, Europe's energy crisis has left few businesses untouched. Some industries, such as the energy-intensive metals sector, are shutting factories that analysts and executives say might never reopen, imperiling thousands of jobs. Mass starvation. Modern agriculture depends on fossil fuels. Natural gas is a prime component of fertilizer, and farming equipment is largely powered by diesel fuel. When natural gas and oil prices go up, food becomes more expensive around the world. According to the president of the World Farmers Organization, prices are 78% higher than in 2021. In many regions in the developing world, farmers simply can't afford fertilizers, or even if they could, the fertilizers are not available to them. Not enough fertilizer means not enough food. While the whole world suffers from an energy crisis, the worst affected are poor nations who are getting outbid for scarce energy supplies. Bangladesh has recently experienced widespread power outages. They simply can't get the energy they need. A desperate Europe is grabbing all it can, leaving this East Asian nation literally in the dark. This will lead to civil unrest. We saw this in Sri Lanka in 2022. Violent riots racked the country following massive crop failures. A leading reason for the crop failures, a lack of fertilizer due to anti-natural gas, anti-fertilizer policies. The root cause of all these problems and the very real suffering that results is the same: not enough fossil fuel. But there is no need for shortages of fossil fuel. We have all the fossil fuel we need, and then some. We are literally standing on it. We just can't get to it. We can't get to it because governments have decided we shouldn't use fossil fuels. They say we're in a climate crisis. But while climate change, humans impacting climate, is a real thing, climate crisis is not. The world is slowly becoming warmer at a cold point in geological history when many more people die of cold than of heat. This doesn't at all justify rapidly restricting global fossil fuel use. Fossil fuels actually make us far safer from climate by providing low-cost energy for the amazing machines that protect us against storms, protect us against extreme temperatures, and alleviate drought. Climate disaster deaths have decreased 98% over the last century. The only rational approach to reducing fossil fuels' climate impacts is a long-term one based on developing truly competitive, reliable forms of energy, most promisingly nuclear energy. Unfortunately, instead of taking this rational approach, governments declared a climate crisis and started immediately restricting fossil fuels, with no viable replacement. They pretended that solar and wind could somehow replace fossil fuels. But since these fuels are inherently unreliable, they can go to near zero at any given time, there was never any reason to believe this. Now we're suffering the consequences of their folly. Instead of rapidly expanding our fossil fuel production, we're begging Saudi Arabia and Venezuela to expand theirs. Europe, which once enjoyed energy security, is now dependent on Russia for the natural gas it needs to heat its homes and power its industry. And outrageously, instead of apologizing for the disastrous anti-fossil fuel policies that caused today's energy crisis, our so-called experts are confidently doubling down, advocating for even more aggressive elimination of fossil fuel production.
So that's quite a significant clip there. And would you tend to agree with his brilliant summation that we're not in a climate crisis? We're in an energy crisis that's been created by crazy policies, Greg.
Oh, absolutely. I love Alex Epstein. He's got a great message. And there's some of these other the erstwhile allies don't speak as forcefully about the existence of or lack of existence of a climate crisis. We have some out there like Bjorn Lomborg and Schellenberger and others that they say, well, yeah, there's a climate crisis that we need to solve, but we're just doing it the wrong way. Or in the United States here, we have a lot of Republicans that say, well, we need to do something. We don't want to spend $3.5 trillion. We just want to spend $850 billion. And I say no, no. One red cent spent to solve a non-existent crisis is one red cent too much.
Okay,
There,
so,
this is
but Greg,
actually
I think you make a very powerful point here because Epstein really says this is a non-existent crisis and we're doing all this damage to people. And I like what you're saying because you're challenging us to say how many of our politicians have bought into this narrative and thereby continue on with really a continuation of policies that still continue to hurt a lot of people.
like he says, they're doubling down on it. Trudeau, where you are, Biden, where we are, these policies will continue as long as these people are still in charge. They're not going to change their ways. They're not going to open their eyes. They're not going to learn the facts that we provide. And one thing we haven't talked, you talked about the nations around the world, the developing nations. A lot of these island nations are right now looking, they've got their hand out saying, we need climate reparations because we're going to be underwater in a few
Yes,
decades.
right.
Let's just touch on, if we can go there for just a moment. For example, the UN says that the nations of the Maldives and the Indian Ocean are the most at-risk island chain in the world. And they say we're going to be underwater in a few years. Okay, well, the Maldives are just above sea level. Let's look at this. 15,000 years ago, the Maldives were also just above sea level. And guess what? Over the last 15,000 years, sea level has risen more than 400 feet. Why are the Maldives not under 400 feet of water, you might ask? And the answer is
Wow.
a geologic process known as accretion. And so what that does, as sea level rises, the nearshore sediments during storm events get washed up onto the island, distributed by animals, and the islands actually grow or accrete as sea level rises. And so what they're doing, sea level's rising right now at the rate of about 7 inches per year. Uh, and so in a few decades, it will have risen 3 inches by the time they say they're going to be underwater. So let me get this right. The last 400 feet of sea level rise didn't put that island nation underwater, but the next 3 inches, look out, that'll do it. And it's just
Yeah.
when you look at it in that context, it's just these claims are just silly. I mean, what
Yeah.
is 3 inches? Barely
No,
above your ankles.
it's really absurd histrionic claims. So speaking of claims then, Greg, is quote green energy the solution? Like in Ontario, we just had the announcement of a major building of a Honda facility for electric vehicles. I believe it's going to create some 1,000 jobs, and the amount of money, the subsidies are amounts to, I believe it's some $14 billion. And you look across this is just happening everywhere, where literally hundreds of billions of dollars are being used to subsidize really a handful of jobs. And I ask myself, is this the solution, Greg? We just need to build more windmills. We need to build more solar panels. Is that the
Oh, not
solution?
not at all, not at all, not at, if we look at the whole life cycle of these of wind turbines, solar panels, look at the mining that's done. All this needs huge batteries too, just because it's producing electricity, and they only do it intermittently. I mean, that's pretty clear with solar. Of course, the sun goes down pretty regularly at the end of each day, and so you don't produce solar for at least 50% or more of the day. Wind power, unfortunately, dies oftentimes just when we need it worst. In very, very cold periods, the doldrums, or the very hot periods, there's no wind or very little wind, and they're not generating the electricity that we need. And it's not a solution at all. They're actually uh, harmful ecologically.
Wow. And all these quote green energy is all based on a government subsidy game. Is that correct?
You betcha.
So the other side to this is what I'm curious about, Greg, is your take on again the need for healthy, open discussion. So information is very important. So I want to talk to you a little bit about the role of the media. In Canada, we have some 2,000 media outlets that are now subsidized by the the federal government. We have dailies that have half their budgets covered by the federal government. I mean, it's just never been seen before. And they have to engage on an agreement around how they cover the news, whether it comes to, quote, diversity, equity, and inclusion, how they look at issues like, what is it again? Oh, yes, climate change. Does that concern you that we have so much media in our world, including in Canada, I think to what extent in the United States, that is really full in on this kind of narrative?
Of course, as a scientist, we believe in free and open debate. The scientific process has been used for many hundreds of years, the scientific method, and it's been abandoned. Here in the United States, it's not taught anymore in schools. In fact, they're teaching that consensus science is real science, when in fact it's nothing of the kind.
Consensus science.
Yes. In fact, we have an education initiative that we launched last year with a new website, co2learningcenter.com, and we're producing books, videos, lesson plans. Here in America, we've got a thriving, growing homeschool movement. All of my grandchildren are homeschooled, and we're providing lesson plans
Wow.
to these teachers so the parents, grandparents can provide this information. And we attended the National Science Teaching Association's annual meeting a year ago. And in it, I published a report. I was the lead author. It was called Challenging the NSTA's Position Statement on Climate Change. And in it, we systematically took down this National Science Teaching Association's policy and just destroyed it. And I published it the first day of the convention. We were overwhelmed with teachers coming after our material. And on the second day, we got visited by the powers that be, the head honchos of the NSTA, along with 3 security guards. And he said, "You need to remove all your materials. You need to take that down." I said, "No." I told him to go pound salt. No, we're not going to do that. We're going to keep these materials up. And he says, "Well, you're going to have to leave." And I said, "Okay, so you're throwing us out." He said, "That's right, get out." He threw us
Isn't
out
that
of
amazing?
this huge
Wow.
conference because we were providing science at a science convention. And it was, well, we left with our heads high. We walked out with our heads high, and we were empowered. We knew we were doing something right.
But this gets back to, as we come to kind of the back end of our discussion, Greg, to what can citizens do in this context? Because I think many people feel disempowered, not empowered by their elected officials to speak their truth in a respectful way, but rather disempowered. And so, in this context, what can citizens do to get at these issues? Because what you said is so true, is that a lot of this is being taught not just in the universities, but in elementary schools, where you are creating another generation of, quote, social justice warriors that are really all about not so much the search for the truth, but in the search of a particular way of thinking.
You need to arm yourself with the facts. And again, we can get that at our website, CO2 Coalition website. Uh, I have 2 powerful books that I've published, Inconvenient Facts and A Very Convenient Warming, that provide very understandable information. Get out there, talk to people, but mainly get aware, arm yourself with the facts. And we're going after the school children, not going after them in a bad way, in a good way, educating them. In fact, our latest book, I was the author of. It's called Chloe the Clownfish Sleeps Well at Night. It's about a clownfish named Chloe that lives on the Great Barrier Reef, and she's scared to death because she was told in class in her school that their home was going to be destroyed and they wouldn't have any place to live, and it was really bad. And so we're able to use a story like that to tell the facts of the
Very
Great
good.
Barrier Reef, which is actually that the Great Barrier Reef has higher coral coverage. It was measured in 2023 than they have since they began measuring it some 40 years ago. It's
So
just
this is
opposite.
great news. This is good news.
It's very good news. It's completely opposite. In fact, Dr. Peter Ridd was a co-author with me. He was fired from his position at James Cook University because he told the truth. And they fired him, and he just won a large settlement because he was dismissed improperly for telling
Oh,
the
good
truth,
for him.
telling the science it's actually happening.
So, speaking of the truth and action, you at the CO2 Coalition, you've got an incredible leading group of scientists like Dr. William Happer and others, John Clauser, the Nobel Prize-winning scientists, talking about red blue exercises where you basically set up and facilitate conscious debates among scientists about the real issues of climate change. Can you tell us what a red blue exercise is and why that is important for helping the public policy process?
Oh yeah, that's what Dr. Happer, for the year that he spent in the Trump administration, that's what he was advancing. These red team, blue team exercises were one group of 20 scientists takes the red position that might be that there's a climate crisis that needs solved and CO2 is a danger. The blue team would take just the opposite, that CO2 is no, it's not a danger, it's a benefit. And you have it out. But they won't debate us. I did participate in one debate at Cornell University a few years ago, but these things are rare, and because they say, well, there's no need for a debate. The science is settled. There's a consensus. Everyone agrees. Well, no, they don't actually. Many thousands of scientists don't agree with that. We certainly don't here at the CO2 Coalition. We say it loudly and proudly. And we provide those pesky facts that keeps getting in the way, of a good, really climate crisis narrative.
So what would be the benefit then? What would be the benefit of a so-called red-blue exercise or debate?
Well, there would be finally the one side, which is CO2 is beneficial, would finally get their day in court. And we're working with that at the CO2 Coalition, hoping we filed comments, amicus briefs with cases that we hope that will eventually get to the Supreme Court. And in that case, if they do go, we will have standing and be able to appear before the Supreme Court to plead our case and provide this information that disputes the climate crisis narrative. And there's a lot of it. And again, we have a compelling argument, and we make it very well.
Okay, so in other words, the red-blue exercise then is actually a very critical exercise to enable decision makers, including elected officials, to realize that there is a debate within climate science. There is no such thing as a consensus, and therefore it behooves us to be able to bring those thoughtful leaders in the room, such as Dr. William Happer and Steve Koonin, who is with the Obama administration, to be able to have this kind of informed debate. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. And we'll get that. We need a platform because the mainstream media, both in Canada and the United States, don't allow me or any others of my colleagues here at the CO2 Coalition to have a platform to speak.
So that is actually a very humbling kind of discussion, Greg, because I think what you're doing with your team of leaders, and certainly at Frontier we try to enable this as well, is to be able to get at the real principles of science and serving Canadians, citizens, with the interests of what is the best public policy that serves them and not some type of industry or subsidy game or special interests. And so I want to commend you very much, Greg, for your courage and your leadership and joining us here today in this discussion.
And thank you for giving us a platform. And you are completely unafraid, and I admire you for that. So thank you. We need to get this information out there.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.